Okay. Right. So, graphics. Ah, no. Mobile. That's right. Thanks. That makes it a bit easier. Few things. Yesterday, we had a class of like 5 people, which was pretty cool. Thanks to the 5 people. I watched the stream. Sorry? Oh, you watched the stream? Cool. Kudos to my stream watchers. I think everyone should just admit they watched the stream. That makes me feel a lot better. Anyway, but beyond that, something we talked about yesterday. That sound good? No. Something we talked about yesterday was not the video recordings, but we talked about projects, right? And since I now learned, like 20 minutes ago, that we have an Easter break ahead of us, thanks for reminding me, guys. I can count on you on that one. You definitely know about the holidays, so that's very student-like. But it's probably time to pick your project, right? If you haven't yet, has everyone sort of a project in mind, or had a random pick at any of the existing ones? I saw some discussions about multiple people being interested in the same kind of project. Just bear in mind that the submission is beginning of April, I recall. Is that correct? Should be written then somewhere here. Anyway, so just please explore the projects there. We added a new one, so a few ones were contributed by you. Thank you very much. Are there any new ideas about projects? If so, please address them. Yep.
I sent one a couple days ago.
Couple of days ago. Did I respond? Or to whom did? To Marius. Did he respond? No. All right. Can you send it to me? Right. So if you manage, can send it even before the break, so we can just perhaps even introduce it at that stage. So that'd be cool. Yep. Any other ideas would be good. One thing I wanted to. Sorry. No. Good. Another idea that I wanted to just mention is from the Internationals office. They have need for an app that helps them manage. Yeah, gear basically. So, because students come here for a year or half a year or a year, 1 semester or 2 semesters and so on, and possibly want to borrow equipment and return it afterwards because it wouldn't make sense to buy, for example, for the short periods of stay here. And the idea is to have an app that helps manage that, right? So a bit of an inventory app, and that's managed by the international office. So you could talk to them and use them as a client for your project. So it's one possible option as well, just to highlight that one, because that's has been added to the list. Yep. Apart from that, there are some good ideas from you guys as well. That either worked on extending one of the labs, in fact, and building on top of that one. Of course, significant contribution on top of the lab idea. For example, there was the rolling ball game and so on, and people want to build on it and actually make a meaningful game out of it as opposed to just a sensor exercise. So that's a possible pathway as well. But if you have any other not problems, but problems as well, I guess, just let me know and then I can add them to a list. The projects, not the problems. So cool. Any other thoughts or questions or non-responding to emails or things like that that I should? Yeah.
That colorblindness app, is that large enough for 4 people?
Yeah. So that. Yeah, that's tough. I think in this case it's worthwhile talking to Philip Green directly because he may have different avenues of approaching it. So perhaps there's a way of compartmentalizing different problems, or exploring different pathways. So basically, you have 4 apps for 4 different purposes, which have a slightly different attack point. I simply don't know enough about the app itself to approach that. So in this case, it would be worthwhile to contact Phil directly.
Because I know 3 other people are interested in it, but I'm not sure if it's large enough for 4 people.
Yeah, intuitively I would have doubts as well, because it looks relatively straightforward-ish, but I'm not sure in how far there's options to push the boundaries to make it more complex, more involved.
I think you got the comments from me because we contacted Philip and we supposed to talk with him today afternoon.
Yeah.
And it looks actually like a little bit too big up for a so short time project, because they want some kind of integration with a lots of different software they are using, and they want to have something that is much better than all these apps that are in the store. So it's I think we just try to say them that it's just like a 5 weeks project, so we probably cannot dedicate more than 10 days of working days each for a project. So
there's limitations.
So that's the limitation. But it's they have some PhD students that are working on the scholar techniques that are probably could support us with this technical issues. But we were just meeting them today. So just can be with us and can be online speaking, I hope. So we can just sit in a group and then talk with them, and then we find out if it's okay for us, or you can take it.
I think
some part.
It would be a good idea. I mean, you can address that talk with the objective in mind, perhaps to compartmentalize, to split up, or to identify features that can be meaningful for them, right? So, but without representing the entire breadth of features. Because if you write a good app that is maintainable and extensible, right, perhaps by the PhD students, or perhaps it's just a framework with one possible implementation of the test that they are dealing with, and they could use it to extend it to different sort of experiments, there could be value in that as well, right? So open up the discussion a bit and see, okay, how can we introduce flexibility that allows you to scale the project to their needs without satisfying everything. So, but I think it's good to set the expectations straight and saying, well, you have 5 weeks and you can't really possibly pull off.
Actually, if it should work fine on the file, then it should have a sufficient backend to gather everything.
That's another aspect.
So
yes.
Actually, this backend is kind of our whole entire bachelor project for this app could be used.
Yeah.
So it cannot be a small project that includes it.
Well, yeah, but it's good. I mean, you have the eye on the right thing, which is scoping. So it's really worthwhile talking and seeing how much you can do. Perhaps if it's just a prototype or one particular example, or only the front end, or or see what has been done. Perhaps they have some steps you can work off as well. I think it is as much valuable to start a project from scratch as it is to continue one, because dealing with other people's code is usually a good learning curve in terms of improving your own coding professionalism. But obviously you would recognize that as well. If you start off with someone else's project, there will be a bit more challenge in terms of research involved, that you actually need to learn what's going on there.
And so we are evaluated how it ends on the end of the April, or so somehow we used 2-3 weeks just to follow the code, and
exactly
it's nothing else we added, and then that's how we will be evaluated then. That
would be a possible risk, exactly. So there's a possible pathway of wasting time as opposed to gaining time, right? So it's But if on the other hand, in the evaluation, if you are straight up about it, hey, we use actually existing code and it's part of a research project, I think we would accommodate that as well, because oftentimes, especially for research purposes, code is usually not that refined. It's basically made to last for an experiment, and that's it's not necessarily a long-term maintained project, which is often quite reasonable. But you guys are looking more into professionalism, so even if you're hardening an existing project, that is actually kind of a meaningful contribution as well, if you see potential for that one. I like those kind of projects because you learn a lot doing that by improving other people's work.
So would it be, for example, possible if we meet you on Monday, you're here on Monday, present the results, and then you will say if it's okay?
Cool. Can do. Yep.
Yes.
That's a very reasonable idea. I like the idea a lot. Yes. Let's do something like that. Or even if you have an intuition already coming up, you can just send me an email, right? Or even for the weekend, I can have a think about it already and so on, and perhaps respond to you. Because I got really some few emails which were really kind of spot on. People suggested really good ideas, and there's nothing much to say, but yeah, let's do it, right? So the key thing for you will be, when we scale ideas, is to figure out what's mandatory, what are you committing to do, and what's the optional bit, right? If you're only hitting the mandatory bit, then most likely your app scope is not big enough, because you know, it may be too simplistic. But as soon as you realize, okay, that's probably out of scope, then it's most likely a core element that you can still have as a minimum viable product, if you like, that you can deliver. So just bear the scope in mind. But usually there should be a way of scaling things down. Yeah, okay, let me know. That sounds good. All right, cool. One thing. Okay, so much about projects. Yesterday we talked a bit about Gradle and the idea of build systems in general, a bit of the history, how they came about, and one of the, I guess, the insights that people should have gotten, whether on stream or in present, is that it's very tightly integrated with the Android platform in this particular case, or Android Studio more like realistically as a build environment. So we kind of addressed this complement area as opposed to just focusing on the code, actually focusing on the build process. And we mentioned implicitly one aspect that's super important for any application development project. Let's guess it's testing. So we need to address that as well. Did any one of you do testing already as part of your labs or in any other context in Android?
No.
Yeah, no. But in Java?
No.
So what do you use in Java?
JUnit.
All right, okay, so you'll be comfortable with this because we'll see that here again. So JUnit is also, since it's basically Java based, or it is Java basically syntax-wise, specification-wise, the unit tests in Android rely on your JUnit as well. So basically it's the same framework you'd be using for that one as well. Cool. But before I get into that, look at this. What kind of testing types are you aware of, or do you know? Bit of brainstorming. You probably had this. I assume it's a third-year course, so you guys have been talking about testing a lot here and there and everywhere. But let's just collate some of them. Yep.
Unit tests.
Unit tests. Cool. Yep. What is their role? What's the purpose?
Test small units of logical functionality.
Yes, right. So centered about increment, like the new atomic functionality in various levels of granularity, but the idea is really identifying units of functionality and test those comprehensively. That's right. So unit tests. Cool. What else?
Stress test.
Sorry?
Stress test.
Stress test. Cool. Yep. When do those tests happen?
On deployment.
Yeah. So yeah. So that's doing the optimization phase where you actually think, okay, now I need to, well, yeah. As part of that, anyway, before deployment, you need to think about, okay, how scalable is my app, and can it actually sustain, the load that is made for, depending what the app is like, especially if it's about stream processing and so on. That's obviously a concern, or if it's about communication with a large number of users and so on. Right, that's cool. Stress test. Yeah. What else?
Static analysis.
Sorry again.
Static analysis.
Static analysis. Yep. Of the course. Yep. Cool. That's right. So it's another. When do we do that?
During development.
Yeah. So goes alongside with the developing of the functional code. That's right.
Usability tests.
Usability tests. Okay. How do they fit in? Yep.
Probably towards the end, but not too late.
Yeah. Okay. Usability tests are a bit kind of tricky one, right? Because they are usually quite. What's the problem with user tests usually? From a.
We need users.
That's number one. Yes. Oh damn, we need to deal with people. What the heck? That's number one. Yeah, of course. But what's the other issue with that? Compared to other tests?
Expensive.
Relatively expensive. Yeah. Slow. Yeah. And think about the data you're getting. Like from a IT point of view.
It's not specific.
it's not easy to process, right? So it's usually qualitative data. Oh no, I didn't like the app because, right? So you need to think about, okay, is there any pattern here I get in my user feedback in the first place? Is it about usability, is it about navigation, or is it about content presentation and so on? So it's actually quite hard to do those easily, and certainly super hard to automate, right? And that makes them very expensive. You mentioned that expensive, so not necessarily the easiest choice of tests. Okay, let's ignore those ones for now, because the users of your app will for now be you. Apart from the projects, of course, that have different stakeholders, you would actually want to present the application to your stakeholder quite early and say, hey, do you want to have a go at it, see how it does, right? So, yep. What other tests do we know about? Where was that? Ah, there you go. Continuous integration tests. Right. Cool. So what are those about for everyone who hasn't dealt with that yet? I think we talked about continuous. Yeah?
Compare the test results from earlier with the new ones to see if there's a change.
Yep.
And then you can check the stability of the application.
Okay. Yeah. So so basically, you're running your application from commit through the entire tool chain to deployment, right? So that's the intuition you're shading, and then you basically see, okay, what is the effect of the change? Are you testing the continuous integration environment in this context, or is it more about the application? To some extent, both. That's right. So you want to. That's one of the tricky things. You need to isolate. Okay, what's the effect? Like in any experiment, you need to figure out what's the independent variables and what's the model itself, right? So if you have a stable, tested, a continuous integration environment that starts with committing, running the tests automatically, having across different levels, other forms of tests, testing deployments, an actual application deployment, for example, or is it actually application code that screws you over? So that's the tricky one with those ones, because they work on a very high level of granularity, right? So they're like a process test basically across the entire all development steps. So as opposed to focusing on individual functional units. That's right. Continuous integration. Okay. What else? I want to see. Here's some more.
Functional and integration tests.
Integration. What is that about?
They're kind of similar in the sense that functional tests sort of focus on a set of functionality.
Yeah.
Whilst integration tests test the relation between those modules.
Yeah.
So that they test that shit works after you integrate something. Yeah. So for example, in an SQL system, you test both sending queries and the result you get back from said query.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. So you're basically testing the integration of multiple independent functional entities, right? In principle, right? So you're construing a test that allows you to test whether those components function, but you don't necessarily testing the components themselves anymore, and certainly you kind of treat them as a black box, right? At this stage, unit checks need to take care of this functional element, and you're only dealing with the integration of it, right? So, yeah, cool. Other tests? I think that's nearly it. No, it's not. Have some more. Sorry? Penetration testing falls similar. Which other test that we mentioned before is similar or relates to that? Relates. I guess stress tests can be related to that one, right? Or do you disagree? I'm happy, open for discussion.
Oh, yeah.
Right. So but fundamentally it can be different, right? So you can be focused on security or stress or performance and so on. So it's somewhat related. So that happens kind of at the later stages of development, right? When the functional environment is complete, your feature fixed, and you're just refining the application you have developed. That's right. Cool. Other tests. What? Yeah. Other tests? No. One important test is what happens if you have a comprehensive, you have a deployed system and you want to do changes. What's the kind of test you need to run then? And that's particularly relevant because we're dealing with the, let's say, Android. If you just deploy one simple application or app, that's quite straightforward, right? So you just ensure that your old kind of database works with the new application and do the necessary changes to it. But if you have a multi-component or more complex app that relies on multiple activities, service, and so on, then you need to think about this as well, right? And how far different activities collaborate together. And what's kind of testing you use for that purpose? I think it was discussed in first year, I hope. Starts with R. No? Okay. Yep.
Is it regression testing?
That's right? So the idea of, did you hear about it before, somewhere, sometime? Right? So it's really about thinking about long-term, from a long-term perspective. Right now, especially now, you're always thinking, okay, I developed this app, I want to get test all incremental elements, right? So having the functionality right, getting integration right, perhaps overall system test, looking at the user perspective, right, ensuring the customer accepts my product that I produce. But if you think about the long term, you actually need to think about maintainability, and then it becomes messy if you just update one component. You can still, test that component and everything will be fine, but how does it interoperate with existing components? Does it have any impact on the larger system? So it's about isolated changes and how they affect an existing runtime system. I think that's probably cover most of the different tests we're doing. And let's guess which ones you're doing here in Android. Sorry? Yep. Anything else? What sounds intuitively reasonable in Android? Unit testing is good. Yep, that's the core of everything. Yep. Okay, let's stick with unit testing. But a bit more. I mean, yeah, we'll get to that. Now, in Android, you also want to think about testing UI, right? So it's not just the functional elements and stuff, but you do some sort of black box testing by just allowing you the test framework to interact with the UI and just see what's happening under the hood, and hopefully the right stuff is spit out on the UI level, but you actually don't care about the functional aspects underneath it, right? So you're just plainly interacting with the UI. That's quite important in the context of Android, but those will be the two tests we're doing, unit tests and UI tests. That's the key idea. So of course there's a large number of different test methodologies, but for Android the recommended way of doing it has been is quite explicitly outlined in the testing fundamentals documentation, and the idea is basically that you take an iterative approach in which you build individual unit tests and then or build individual functionality, test those with unit tests, and then perform UI tests to see it as kind of an integration test of the individual functional units and see if your app passes that one. So it's not like looking at the big picture like a system-wide test for at least in this context, but really looking at your app level and seeing the UI as the overall kind of interaction mechanism, therefore like the system level test you need to perform. So it's multi-level iterations. So if UI test fails, refine a unit test and see if they pass, and then ensure that your UI test pass, potentially refactor if necessary, and reiterate over that cycle. So if you do any change, ensure that you have a corresponding unit test, see that it passes. If it doesn't, refine it. If it passes, check UI tests. If they fail, refine those ones, or adapt, move back into the functional units and check that those work properly. See if the UI test passes again, or in worst case, then adapt the UI level functionality if necessary. So that's the idea. So you always iterate between the function level, unit tests, and UI tests. And for this purpose, to have a more systematic approach, the Android testing pyramid has been laid out this as well. If you want to see more details or hear more details about it, I recommend you to watch the Google I/O talk from 2017 on testing. It's about 1 hour, and there's quite a bit of information about Android testing. In fact, the entire testing fundamentals are covered there, and we only look at glimpses of them, some aspects of it. But the key idea is that the testing pyramid defines the extent of tests and the number of tests you're going to write. Because if you have a larger application or app, you want to ensure that you want to spend the time on the right level. And intuitively, as you probably agree, you most likely end up writing the most number of tests on which level? Please.
Unit tests?
Unit tests, right? So you'd have large number of small scale unit tests that test the baseline functionality, and that's the minimum test you want to do. So if you can't be bothered to do a UI test for various reasons, perhaps because it's tedious or is to some extent device specific, it's probably an Android specific more than unit tests. The most important bit is to have individual units of functionality tested.
Would that make more sense to try to test higher up so that it sort of trickles down to the lower levels, so that you automatically test several things with one test as well at higher level?
Of course, yeah, I agree, but that wouldn't follow the idea of test-driven development, right? So because then you would develop all the functional units already and only test them at the end, which you can do, but this is more. Yes, I mean, yes, you can write one massive UI test that hopefully tests everything, but it will not necessarily be conclusive as to what went wrong, right? Whereas during development for individual features, you will detect it a lot earlier if you start from bottom up. So yes, I agree. To capture potential errors, you're right. UI test could do, especially if it covers all possible paths of navigation and interaction. But it most likely firstly won't. It's really hard to determine coverage of a UI test, right? Because it uses the underlying functionality as a black box. So whereas in unit tests it's super straightforward to calculate coverage, right? Because you know exactly which methods are invoked or which code of the class is used. So this is a good way of ensuring comprehensive testing of your code base. That's the advantage. And you won't have surprises later on. For example, functionality you don't happen to be used in UI or only in a very rare circumstances will only come up at a later stage. But of course, as a sanity check, I agree, UI testing, and that's what this suggests here, UI testing is the final test that should be run to assess your system. But if we start developing, I think it's quite important, especially if you're focusing on functionality that's independent from UI, to do it early and often using unit tests. So the next high level would be integration tests. That is the integration of different components, right? So what are application components we're dealing with in Android? Repetition, exam, that need to be integrated and tested against it. Yep.
Content providers?
Yes, exactly. Right, exactly. One of those content providers. What else do we have? Services, it's right. So, you know, okay. So all those ones, right? It's activities, services, content providers, yeah. And this would be a subject of an integration test where you actually test the interaction between those different components. But that's obviously more relevant for larger scale applications in which the interaction pathways are not necessarily predefined as well. Because a service could interact with multiple activities, whereas in probably in our case most likely it will be one activity, one service interaction. So for this purpose you will generally get away with simple functionality test and a UI test, because you don't have that massive amount of integration. And of course on top sits the UI test that tests the overall interaction with the app that you have. And the suggested focus on or distribution of tests is to have about 70% of unit tests. So of all tests you write, 70% would concentrate on the base functionality, and the remaining 30% would then concentrate on integration or UI tests. So the weight is quite clear. It should be clearly on unit testing. So if you are in doubt or you need to invest time, start with unit testing first before you're moving further up the ladder. So yeah, so that's the key idea there in the Android world. So if we're looking at Android tests in particular, it differentiates between two types of tests, particular in Android Studio. If you see it, you kind of automatically redirected into it. On the one hand, you have local unit tests that run on the JVM largely, so that will not even run on the device, but rather on your code base locally. And then tests that not so much only focus on individual functionality that you wrote, but actually interaction with the Java framework, sorry, the Android framework in particular, and that relies on Android functionality. So that's referred to as instrumentation test, where you emulate the infrastructure of Android, not necessarily by running it on a real device, because there are mocked versions of the Android library available as well, so that emulate responses you get from the device. But here the idea is to potentially also run it on an emulator or beyond this. So we'll see, and this is one way of using, for example, UI elements, accessing them, whereas in the unit test you probably wouldn't deal with that at that level. So there's a number of tools available that you can use for that purpose. JUnit, you guys know that. Everyone knows JUnit, or only some? The 30 is definitely. The rest, no? Okay, no, it's perfectly valid. Good, cool. So we'll cover that a bit. Then there is other mechanisms such as mocking, so you can mock functionality. So what's mocking about?
Pretend that something exists.
Yeah, very nice, exactly. Yeah. So how does that work in well, how do you would we think about what does it mean in terms of testing? Why would I pretend that something exists?
If I have, for example, I don't know, database or a server that
Yeah.
should respond somehow on a request.
Yeah.
So then I just admit that this request generated this response, and I will test things that are dependent on it.
Yeah. Cool. Good idea. So the idea is basically that if you have an application, for example, where you can't be bothered implementing the entire database, or actually don't because you still subject to development, or it will be developed by a different team, but you know the interface, meaning that part is well defined. You actually know what's the data you're sending to the database and what's the typical example data you would get as a response. Then the idea is to mock this entire thing. So you basically behave as if it was existing, and upon a particular request, just blindly return the response you pre-codified. So you don't actually, you emulate the functionality, but obviously you don't have the actual underlying functionality, but just a blind, stupid response by this mocked component. So you can test your app functionality, right? So particularly in the context of database, is also quite helpful because you don't want to have changes persist, right? So if you want to test changes on a database, you don't want to affect the persistent data that's in that database, and not necessarily have a test database either. If you don't want to enforce to do that, then you can easily mock it by basically mocking responses. So well said. Good. Cool. So other frameworks that exist are Roboelectric. We'll probably not explore that. That's a way of virtually testing the UI in Android. That's specific to Android there. We'll have a look later at this one. But the most commonly used UI testing framework in Android is Espresso, which emulates interaction with the UI. So that's the key idea there that we interact with. Cool. In terms of unit testing, last. Do I see that here actually? No, I don't. That'd be very nice if I had. Give me a second. So yesterday we briefly talked about the functionality of Gradle, or the role of Gradle in the context of Android build, and identified that Gradle has plugins for different programming languages, including C++, Java, but also Android, that have specific functionality. So in this case, we need to specify dependencies, and typically the dependencies you would see in an Android environment would be, of course, the possibly app compatibility libraries, but for tests, specific to tests, and we would have additional libraries, and the dependencies are usually JUnit in some form or fashion, a test runner that's available, and the Espresso framework that's used for UI testing. And as you notice here, the different dependency types are or the availability or necessity of dependencies in different stages of the development life cycle are denoted here. For example, for implementation, we need the libraries that are included in the file system, as well as the app compatibility library. But for tests, you see here, you have two types of dependencies. One of them is called test implementation. The other one is called Android test implementation. And earlier I talked about the idea that, let's see. So earlier I talked about the idea that we have individual JVM-based tests, which would be equivalent to unit tests that just focus on individual functionality. And we have the more comprehensive Android tests that work, for example, UI tests that work in the Android system. And those would be instrumented tests. And those would be the latter ones. So the Android test implementation are the high-level UI tests, whereas instrumented tests, whereas test implementation are just basic unit tests that we use in Android. So just to highlight that, we get back to that in a second. Do you guys want to have a break first before we do some examples? Probably worthwhile to take a break. I don't know, how many minutes do you need? 5, 10? I heard 3 values here, so I take the mean value, which is 10. Okay, cool. 10 past 12. 10 past 1, not 12, sorry.